Mistakenly believing in a scumbag man and a lowly woman, blinded by the honest gentleman of a scumbag man, he sincerely fed the dog, and ended up with resentment, buried in the sea of fire. As soon as she opened her eyes, Yana was reborn. Saying that she is a rural girl who doesn't understand fashion or trends, her exports are foreign languages that others don't understand, and she understands fashion matching better than everyone else. She always leads the trend and leads the way. She is known for her ruthlessness in dealing with both her father and son, but who knows that she has a sharp eye and is ruthless in her actions. People who are with her are either extremely wealthy or lucky, and working together will definitely make money. Being friends with the princess, the queen worshipping her son, and the emperor protecting her in this life, Yana decided not to be moved by her heart or emotions, only to live for revenge. She insisted that anyone who deceived her sincerity and destroyed her trust would be repaid 100 times. But for those who are alone in the cold, they will eventually receive a beam of light from her, pulling her out of darkness and bringing her in the sunshine. Keywords of the novel. After Rebirth, the script for the eldest daughter's revenge has no pop-ups. After Rebirth, the complete text of the script for the eldest daughter's revenge can be downloaded. After Rebirth, the latest chapter of the script for the eldest daughter's revenge can be read. Chapter 1. Death Without Closing Your Eyes. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Death Without Closing Your Eyes. Yana has been locked up in the yard for countless days. All she knows is that piano or orchestral music often comes from outside. She caressed her bulging abdomen, her cheeks sunken, and her skin waxy yellow, like a dying person. But who would have known that she was the first wife of the current richest business president in Beijing and Shanghai? After the overthrow of the Yangchuan dynasty, the current Haiqing was dominated by foreigners. Yana no longer holds high hopes, only wants to have a safe baby. But just then, the door that had never been opened since she entered suddenly opened. Yana was overjoyed and saw her husband Gu Xiaojun at a glance. She was almost tearful, thinking that her husband was here to pick her up and leave. When Yana walked forward, she was viciously grabbed by the man's hair. "Bitch, you're still restless here. How dare you frame Lehman's child?" Yana froze and said, "Xiaojun, I didn't." "You didn't. The cook who gave Lehman abortion pills has confessed, it was you who instructed her." Gu Xiaojun said fiercely, "Yana, you killed Lehman's child. Your child must pay for her life." Yana was greatly shocked and knelt in front of him, saying, "I really didn't do it, and my child is also your child. You are the child's father, you can't do this. Hee, who cares about the child crawling out of your belly? What good things can rural women produce?" Gu Xiaojun looked disdainful. Yana stiffened fiercely. Unexpectedly, the man who had sworn in love with her back then, just like others, despised her background. But he clearly said he wouldn't do it. "I don't want Xiaojun anymore. I don't want to share your property, nor do I want your wife's position. I can make way for Lehman. Even if you want my life, I will accept it. But please spare the child." Yana wailed and burst into tears. "You killed my child, you must use your child to pay for it, and you. I will also keep it and torture it slowly." Lehman suddenly walked in, with the maid behind her still holding medicine. "Lehman, why are you here? You just gave birth, how can your body withstand it?" Gu Xiaojun looked heartbroken. "Master, whenever I think of our child, I feel heartbroken and wish I could kill this poisonous woman." Lehman glared fiercely at Yana and said, "Honglian, what are you still doing? Hurry up and pour the abortion medicine into this poisonous woman." Red Lotus immediately stepped forward, and Yana hurriedly stood up, but was shot in the leg by Gu Xiaojun with a firearm. Yana screamed incessantly. Faced with the handed abortion medicine, she struggled desperately, but the next second she was pierced in the arm by Gu Xiaojun. Being held down by several servants, Yana was filled with a whole bowl of abortion medicine. This medicine took effect quickly, and Yana suddenly felt severe pain in her abdomen. Looking at the men and women hugging each other in front of her, a strong hatred surged in her chest. Livestock. When you were abandoned by your family, only I was willing to be with you. As a married couple for 13 years, I accompanied you to fight the world together, and how many times we survived in death. The first child was because I blocked a shot for you and it's gone. Now you're shooting at me and killing my other child with your own hands. What qualifications do people like you have to give birth to Xiao Jun's child? Su Liman spared no effort in mocking. Looking at her once gentle and now vicious sister in front of her, Yana only felt like a joke. When she first came from the countryside, Su Liman treated her the best. Afterwards, she married someone who was not human and was subjected to domestic violence. Yana brought her, who had divorced, back home, but she ended up getting involved with her husband. Of course, Gu Xiaojun is not a good person either. Over the years, she has wandered around the circle of wealthy women for him, and in order to facilitate his business dealings with Nanyang people, she has also specifically studied foreign languages day and night of hard study. Like the old society's imperial examination rush, many sleepless nights were all for him. But now we have come to such a fate, being betrayed and tortured by the person next to us and our own sister. Su Liman was overjoyed and said, "Oh, by the way, you don't know yet, do you? You, Amu Guan Shi, were the one I, Amu, sent to solve. A crude person like her, what qualifications does she have to go to the capital to enjoy happiness?" Yana suddenly froze, her whole body icy cold. She didn't expect that Amu's departure was not accidental, but rather a murder. 10 days after Amu's death, she was taken to the capital. Yana thought that Su Hailin knew about her Amu's death and couldn't bear that she had no one to take care of her, so she was able to be taken to the capital. Ah! The departure of the child and the truth about Amu's death have completely shattered her. Yana rushed towards the two with crimson eyes. Gu Xiaojun had a cold and unmoved expression on his face, and directly used a firearm to pierce through Yana's other leg. "Just because you still want to make a move in front of me, bah." Gu Xiaojun spat out a mouthful of saliva and hugged Su Liman before leaving. Yana lay empty on the ground, suddenly burst into laughter. It seemed like she was laughing, but in reality, she was crying. The big pool of blood on the ground was hers. That night, a raging fire broke out in the remote courtyard of the Su family's most corner, quickly devouring the people inside. Yana sat slumped in the flames, shedding tears of despair and numbness. "Gu Xiaojun, Su Liman, if there is an afterlife, I will never let you go. Even if you transform into a fierce ghost, I will make you pay for it with blood and blood." End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Nirvana Rebirth. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Nirvana Rebirth. From now on, this will be your home. Understand the rules and don't embarrass us. Yana shook her mind for a moment, then opened her eyes and saw a pair of men and women. She was startled. It's Su Hailin and Wang Yuanyue. Looking at the familiar scene and the young couple, it coincided with a scene in her memory. It was the day she was just brought back from the countryside. Yana looked at the wicker box sewn with hemp rope with a hole at her feet, almost certain that she had been reborn. Her dying wish came true. "I'm talking to you, did I hear you?" Su Hailin frowned displeasedly. There was a hint of killing intent in Yana's eyes, but it was quickly concealed. This is her father, who abandoned his wife and daughter and promised to go to the capital to take the imperial examination, but colluded with the daughter of the current princess and forcefully divorced his wife. In her past life, she knew that she was being imprisoned and abused with a big belly, but she was greedy for Gu Xiaojun's wealth and ignored her, even allowing Wang Yuanyue to kill her biological friend Amu. Yana had a raging flame burning in her heart, but she knew that her wings were not yet full, so she had to hide her sight and keep her low. She timidly said, "Yes, father." Wang Yuanyue looked at the girl in front of her and felt that she was easy to handle. Time has changed, and Su Hailin's official position has become bigger and bigger, even surpassing the royal family. However, he was criticized for abandoning his wife and daughter back then, and for the sake of his children's reputation, he had to bring them back first. But the original partner Guan Shi cannot return. Su Yana seemed hesitant and uneasy, as she dressed in patched linen clothes and looked so out of place with the magnificent Su mansion. Wang Yuanyue kindly said, "Elegant, you've worked hard these years. It's really not easy to find you. Now that you're back home, no one will bully you anymore." Su Yana nodded, but her long eyelashes fell, blocking not only the clear black and white eyes, but also the hatred deep inside her eyes. Su Hailin asked, "Over the past few years, have you harbored resentment in your heart? If it is the same as the previous life?" Su Yana sneered in her heart. Originally, he also knew that he was sorry for her and Amu. This answer is very important. In her past life, she was just not adaptable and stuttered in denial, causing Su Hailin to worry. In the future, she will be endlessly estranged from her. She wants revenge. Before becoming strong, Su Hailin's trust is very important. The little girl looked at her father firmly and said, "No, my daughter knows that my father must have had some last resort. There is no father who doesn't love his daughter." Su Hailin nodded contentedly and said, "Like a kind father, since I have returned home, my father will not treat you unfairly. In January, remember to prepare some nice clothes for Yana. Tomorrow, Yana will welcome the banquet. Please take care." "Okay, sir." Wang Yuanyue is very enthusiastic. "As long as you bring her back, no one will gossip about their family, just give her food and drink like raising a dog." Wang Yuanyue has a good abacus. When Su Yana returned, it was the dining spot where she met Su Liman, the daughter of Wang Yuanyue. Son Su Qining, on the other hand, rushed to study abroad in Nanyang and only returned 6 months later. And Su Liman, like in his past life, showed great care and concern for her sister. Su Yana thought she was good in her past life, and it wasn't until the day she died that she realized how cunning this half-sister was. But it's okay, the debts they owed in their past lives will be repaid by them in this life and present life. Double the reward. After finishing dinner, Su Hailin didn't pay much attention to the daughter and handed her over to Wang Yuanyue before going to the Yihong courtyard. A few foreign girls came to Yihongyuan, with big buttocks and blue eyes, very excited. Wang Yuanyue said, "Elegant, go back to your room first. Amu has something to deal with your sister on his end." "Okay, ma'am." "Huan Am, she also deserves it." Su Yana smiled. Wang Yuanyue originally did not like the children born to the Guan family, so she naturally liked her to be humble. Therefore, she did not emphasize that she changed her mind, but only asked the maid to take her to the room. After everyone left, Liani stood there, not intending to help Su Yana carry the wicker crate. Just like the previous life, Su Yana carried the rattan box herself, followed the maid around, and went up to the second floor. As she climbed the stairs, Liani admonished, "I tell you, our Su mansion is a wealthy family. Don't bring those bad habits from your countryside with you, just like your mother from the countryside, she can't stand it. Otherwise, I'll kick you out every minute." Speaking of her birth, Su Yana's calm eyes flashed with a hint of anger. Ripple was unaware and even scolded her like a spring onion. She glanced at the stairs behind her. "Well, that's enough height." Ripples. "Ah. Pa." Ripple impatiently turned around and before she could react, she faced a big fight. "Damn it." Yana arched left and right, slapped twice, and kicked the Ripples directly with one foot. Ah. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Revenge begins. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Revenge begins. The Ripples rolled all the way down, with a blue nose and swollen face. She lay on the ground, grinning in pain and saying, "How dare you be unreasonable to me? If you really are a wild girl from the countryside with no manners, I will go find my wife." Ripple cried and left. Yana smiled coldly at the corner of her mouth, ignoring everything. Wang Yuanyue was also going out, so she finally made an appointment with Mrs. Gu to play cards. Of course, playing cards is secondary, mainly to take my daughter to meet the eldest son of the Gu family. The Gu family is a diplomat, and his eldest son Gu Jinfan has drunk foreign ink. The current Yangchuan dynasty is not as good as before, only those who can speak well and have connections in front of foreigners are popular. But Wang Yuanyue was just about to leave and Mrs. Gu had something to do and let her go. While she was getting upset, Liani suddenly came to report that Yana had taken action against her. Wang Yuanyue's expression was unsightly. "I didn't expect Yana to be so restless and cause trouble on her first day here." She didn't say a word and asked someone to bring Yana over. Yana has been sitting on the stairs, holding her cheeks in both hands, waiting for someone to come and find fault. "Madam, let you go over." Ripple swollen half of her face and proudly said. Yana looked at the time and went to the front hall. As soon as Wang Yuanyue saw her, she frowned and patted the table, saying, "Yana, what's wrong with you? Why are you so arrogant on your first day? Even my maid, you dare to take action. What else can't you do?" Yana stood motionless, lowered her head, and remained silent. Wang Yuanyue refused reluctantly and angrily rebuked, "Don't think you just need to stay silent. You were so reckless on the first day, and you'll have to deal with it in the future. Someone, let me slap her mouth and don't teach you a lesson. You really think this is your countryside?" Her gaze fell on Ripple, who immediately approached proudly to slap Yana. "What are you doing?" At the critical moment, Su Hailin appeared at the door, holding a 5-year-old child in his hand. Ripple was startled and immediately withdrew her hand. "Here we go." Yana's eyes were filled with dim light, but it was quickly replaced by mist. She was charming and said, "Father, you've come back to me. They bullied me." She ran to Su Hailin's side with grievances, tears streaming down her face. Su Hailin frowned, but didn't rush to scold. He casually summoned a servant to take the children around him to wash their hands. Yana glanced casually at the child and had already figured out the first move. Wang Yuanyue's face turned ugly, thinking that he had caused a loss of life. "Master, whose family does that child belong to? Who's important? What's up with you?" Su Hailin lowered his head and glanced at Yana, looking at his daughter's red eyes, somewhat softened. Whether it's his own flesh and blood, he despises Guan Shi's rudeness, but his daughter is delicate and obedient, even softer than Liman's. There is no daughter whose father dislikes softness and coquettishness. Wang Yuanyue was about to say something, but Yana spoke up before her, "Father, do you think I come from the countryside? In fact, if father doesn't like his daughter, she can stay in Yao County for a long time. Who did you hear?" Upon hearing the word rural, Su Hailin frowned. He also comes from Yao County, and over the years, as he has been climbing up the ladder, his background has been the most ridiculed, so he is also very sensitive to this term. "It's what Liani said. Liani said that I come from a rural background and have many bad habits in the countryside. If there is no room for my daughter in this city, she can leave." Yana seemed to be angry and rushed out the door without even picking up her luggage. This startled Su Hailin. After all, he even spoke up and brought back his original daughter. Tomorrow is the reception banquet, and if she runs away, what will happen to tomorrow's banquet? Absolutely nothing. Who said these words? Su Hailin's sharp gaze fell on Wang Yuanyue. Wang Yuanyue clicked and looked at Liani. Liani immediately knelt on the ground and said, "It's a servant." Su Hailin's face turned ugly as he slapped her and said, "Damn it, you can also arrange Miss Su from the Su family. Coming from a rural background. What's wrong with coming from Yao County? Why is it just a rural background? Even if it's a rural background, you're not a rural person yet. He was stabbed in the pain and angrily rebuked Ripple. Ripple dared not speak and timidly lowered her head. Lieni is Wang Yuanyue's confidant, and even after being beaten, Wang Yuanyue couldn't help but feel embarrassed and said, "Master, you don't need to make such a big fuss. This is nothing, and Lieni doesn't mean that either." "Why not?" Lieni said that because I was born in Yaoxian and have a lot of bad breath, she just looks down on people born in Yaoxian. Su Yana interrupted Wang Yuanyue's words with both tone and expression, but when facing Su Hailin, she was extremely obedient. She asked sadly, "Father, in the eyes of these people, is it really unbearable that we come from Yao County?" "Unbreakable. No matter how unbearable it is, some people still respectfully call us miss when they see us. It's not about serving your father and managing his family business. Those people are just arrogant, nothing." Su Hailin was full of anger as he pointed at the mulberry trees and cursed the locust trees. Wang Yuanyue was overwhelmed by yin and yang, and her face couldn't turn away, but she was very clever and knew that continuing the topic would not benefit her. The Wang family is no longer as strong as before, and even has to rely on the Su family. She knows she wants to please her husband. "Master, don't be angry. I was planning to play cards with Mrs. Gu just now, so I didn't know that Miss Lieni didn't understand the rules so well. I will definitely punish her severely later." "Don't be angry." Wang Yuanyue stepped forward and patted Su Hailin's chest, acting coquettishly with a gentle smile. Although Su Hailin was angry, he didn't want to fall out with Wang Yuanyue over this matter and show off his authority towards Wang Yueyuan. Instead, he vented his anger on Wang Yuanyue for wanting to cling to the Wang family during his youth. "This girl must be well disciplined. In January, you have been the head of the household for so many years. Why don't you even teach the people around you a lesson? If there's another time, you don't have to be the head of the household anymore." Wang Yuanyue was scolded in front of Su Yana and her servants, which was very embarrassing, but even though she was very embarrassed, she still had to apologize. Wang Yuanyue has been favored by countless people since childhood, how could she have suffered such humiliation? Su Yana's expression was calm, her eyelashes lightly closed, and the sarcasm in her eyes was hard to detect. "By the way, in January, the person from the Gu family will come over later. You are welcome and don't neglect it. That child is from the Gu family." Su Hailin had something else to say, but the butler suddenly came over and said there was an issue with the accounts. Su Hailin, who is obsessed with money, can never tolerate a penny's mistake and should go over to investigate immediately. Wang Yuanyue was originally full of anger. As soon as she heard that the Gu family would come, she immediately went to find Su Liman and asked her to dress up well, without considering Su Yana for a moment. Su Yana looked at the two of them disappearing one by one at the door, her lips cold and hooked. She won her first battle. But this is just the beginning. The first round is not over yet. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Blood Debt and Blood Compensation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4 Blood Debt and Blood Compensation. Another maid will take Su Yana back to her room. The maidservant is dedicated to serving her, called Jiyue. Su Yana knew that Jiyu was very honest in her previous life. Once, she was falsely accused of stealing something, which was because Yu was under pressure to testify for her, but her explanation failed. She also pointed out that Yu was later expelled from the Su family. Su Yana's past life did not refer to the moon, but in this life she has too much to do, and it is necessary to cultivate a few confidants. She walked up to the dressing table and handed the silver ear ring on the table to Jiyue. This is what Su Hailin bought for her to fill the scene. Jiyu dared not take it and knelt on the ground. Su Yana smiled lightly and held her hand, putting the silver ear ring over her. Is that right? From now on, you will be my maid. As long as you are obedient and sincerely serve me, there will be benefits for you. There will only be more in the future. Ji-yu respectfully said, "Yes, Miss San." Yana quickly lifted her eyes, revealing a cold light. "I am the oldest young lady in this family, call me Mississippi." "Yes." Yana sat in front of the dressing mirror, looking at her young self, with a complex mix of bitterness and grievances in her heart, but more importantly, it was hatred. The sincerity of the past life have come to such an end. Hee. It's hard to die. Her eyes turned red, with blood dripping from them. Yana suddenly saw the blue ink and pen on the table. At this time, these foreign things were very popular, but for those who were used to holding a brush, how could they get used to holding a pen? But now that pens are popular, wealthy people want to keep up with the trend and give themselves a face. Even if they don't know how to, they still have to buy them. Pens are valuable, but for the Su family, they are not a big deal. Su Hailin owes her and her AMU so much, so she has to compensate with the entire Su family. As for Su Liman, Gu Xiaojun blood debts are paid with blood, life is not worth dying in order to pay debts. She suddenly stood up and left. Ji-yu asked inexplicably, "Miss, where are you going?" "The backyard." Yana arrived in the backyard, and as expected, she saw the child lying on the stone table writing with a pen. Yana walked forward, but the servants knew her identity and did not stop her. "Little one, what are you writing?" The little boy looked up at Yana, very reserved. He didn't speak, but his back turned to Yana. Yana is not surprised that this child has such a reaction. She heard in her past life that this child has an autistic tendency. She took the paper written next to the child and saw that the handwriting was crooked and twisted. "The writing is pretty good, it looks much better than when I first started learning pen handwriting." The little boy was stunned, looking at her with a look of confusion and surprise. Yana looked at the little boy gently and rubbed his head, saying, "You don't know, little one. When I first started learning to write with a pen, I was not good at drawing. I even had to struggle with holding a pen, and the words I wrote couldn't understand what they were." At this point, she felt ashamed and said, "But after practicing, I wrote much better." She took the pen from the little boy's hand and wrote her name, Yana, on a white paper. Yana's pen handwriting is very square, elegant but not lacking in grandeur, very beautiful. In her past life, she had to walk back and forth in the circle of wealthy wives, and many of Gu Xiaojuan's business was facilitated by her friendship with these wives. Among them, teaching these wealthy women who want to take a step towards the new style to write pen characters is one of the connecting points to make friends with them. The little boy was very surprised when he saw her and stuttered, asking her, "Really, really?" "Yes, it looks good." The child's speech was not complete, but Yana could roughly guess what he was trying to say. "Yes, it could look very nice. In the future, when you have time, come and play with your sister more often. Your sister will also teach others how to write with a pen. Would you like to go to your sister's room and let her teach you how to write with a pen?" The little one's eyes lit up, and he wanted to speak, but couldn't say a word. In the end, he could only nod hard. But later on, Yana did not immediately take him to her room and continued to talk to him in place, occasionally looking back. When she saw two nauseating shadows moving rapidly from the rockery, she pointed to the two servants and said, "You two go tell father that this child wants to come with me to the room to learn pen handwriting." The domestic slaves hesitated. Yana's expression turned cold as she changed her previous easygoing demeanor. "What's wrong? Is it possible that I can't command you because I'm a new young lady? Don't forget, I'm a young lady no matter what. I still have the right to sell a few servants." The servant panicked upon hearing this, and coupled with the fact that it was indeed a child who voluntarily followed, they had nothing to say. "Little one, go immediately." They left immediately. The coldness in Yana's eyes disappeared in the moment she lowered her head. She was originally a cute-looking person, and in the eyes of children, she was very approachable. The little boy didn't have much guard against her as a result. Yana held an ink kettle in one hand and a little boy in the other. They walked along the long corridor and coincidentally met Wang Yuanyue and Su Liman in front of each other. "Lu man, hurry up. Let's get to the hall early. If we don't know, the family members will come soon. It's from the Gu family, not Mr. Jin Fan, and the person may not arrive immediately. You'd better grow dim sum. That's Mr. Gu, a famous diplomat today. You should keep your best image in front of him." The mother and daughter hurriedly rushed towards the front hall, and when they looked up, they saw Yana standing in front, holding a child in her hand. Wang Yuanyue recognized the child brought back by Su Hailin, frowned, but didn't say anything, and pulled Su Liman away. Su Liman only longed for the positions of Mr. and Mrs. Gu, and did not pay attention to them. However, as they passed by, the little child suddenly grabbed the ink from Yana's hand and threw it onto Su Liman like this. Ink splashed, and Su Liman's goose-yellow dress was dyed blue in a large area. Even Yana couldn't escape the splashing of ink. Su Liman immediately screamed, "Ah! What are you doing, stinky little kid? These clothes are very expensive, I bought them at a foreign department store." Wang Yuanyue also had an unpleasant expression. In order to impress Gu Jinfan, she spent half a month's effort to buy this dress for her daughter. Yana immediately protected the child behind her and said, "The child was not intentional. Why don't we wait for the child's father to come and compensate you?" Su Liman roared angrily, "This stinky child is probably a distant relative of the Gu family, poor relative. He has some damn money. People in Beijing know that poor relatives of the Gu family often come to eat and drink. Su Liman has been longing for this garment for a long time and has been reluctant to wear it, just afraid of getting worn out." She was furious and pulled out the little boy behind Yana, and the newly made nails fell directly into the little boy's forearm. The little boy was in pain, his face changed dramatically, but he didn't cry or make a fuss. Yana's expression moved and she frowned, but she paused her forward movement. Su Liman roared angrily, "What exactly do you want to do? You dare to throw ink at me, Mississippi? You're too brave. Let me teach you a lesson." After speaking, she slapped the little boy's face loudly. At the critical moment, Yana grabbed Su Liman's wrist. Su Liman didn't take it seriously and wanted to retract his hand, but he found that Yana's hand was surprisingly strong. Yana's eyes lifted a strong chill, and she also pinched her other hand from the little boy's arm, saying, "I'm sorry, he didn't mean to." Her eyes were extremely cold, but she was smiling with a very penetrating expression. "If it's just two things, slapping is too much." The little boy glanced at Yana and instinctively hid behind her, while the little one's white robe showed 5 small dots of red. "Yana, what do you mean? On your first day back, you dare to show off in front of me." Suleiman is so angry at the moment that he can't hold on anymore. Wang Yuanyue also scolded with a cold face, "Yana, you don't want to be shameless. You don't care about anything, it will only harm you." "Oh. Really? I'm curious about how you're trying to harm me." Speaking of which, a strange smile curved around her lips. Wang Yuanyue's heart suddenly jumped, feeling that something was wrong, but she couldn't say what was wrong. And just then, a furious voice suddenly came. "What are you doing?" End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Offending Big Figures. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Offending Big Figures. Su Hailin suddenly appeared, with a man wearing a white shirt standing next to him. The man has a slender figure, handsome and highly bookish, with a tall nose bridge and golden glasses. The little boy, upon seeing the man, immediately shed tears of grievance and said a sentence that no one understood before running towards him. But Yana understood. There was a hint of pleasure in her eyes, knowing that Wang Yuanyue and her daughter were in dire straits. "Father, you came just in time. Look at this wild child who came out of nowhere and splashed his daughter with ink. Su Liman was still too young to notice Su Hailin's iron-green expression. Wild child. The man suddenly gave a cold smile and lowered his head to ask the child a few words. Su Liman suddenly realized that the man was very handsome and became shy. Su Yana almost didn't laugh out loud. As expected, he was young and didn't even notice the difference between Su Hailin and this man. Su Hailin immediately reprimanded, Su Liman, what are you doing? This child is Mr. Gu's younger brother. Su Liman's expression changed greatly, realizing what she had just done. She quickly explained, there was a misunderstanding, this is definitely a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. In my opinion, my younger brother's appearance here is a mistake. Gu Jinfan looked at Su Hailin coldly, Mr. Su, I see the goods from Nanyang. You don't need to take over. I think the Liu family is more suitable. Su Hailin's expression changed greatly. The batch of southern foreign goods was very valuable, and whoever took over would make money. Mr. Gu, Gu Jinfan was very indifferent, picked up the little boy and left. Su Liman realized later that he had caused trouble and ran away. Su Hailin was furious and grabbed Su Liman back, slapping him hard. Su Liman never heard a heavy word from childhood to Dalian, let alone being beaten, and suddenly became confused. My business has been ruined by you. Do you know how much money that batch of goods can make? Su Hailin was furious, as if Su Liman was his enemy. He saw Gu Xiangji lost with his wet nurse on the street and didn't even go to Yihong courtyard, so he brought him back as a favor. All the business that could have been obtained just by raising your hand has now been ruined. Su Liman was frightened, and Wang Yuanyue immediately protected her daughter behind her. Master, if you have something to say, you should take action. Our Wang family and Gu family also have some friendship. I will let my father go and intercede, maybe there can be a turning point in the situation. It's better to be like this, otherwise I won't spare you. Su Hailin gritted his teeth. And master, we can't blame this either. If it weren't for Yana bringing the young master from the family over, such a thing wouldn't have happened. Wang Yuanyue won't let Su Yana stay out of it, she will definitely be dragged into the water. Upon hearing this, Su Hailin frowned and looked at Su Yana, okay, you actually caused this. Seeing Su Hailin about to vent her anger on herself, Su Yana remained calm and composed. Father, the young master and I had a good conversation and took the initiative to go to the study with me to write with a pen. Unexpectedly, we met Madam and Miss San in the corridor. The ink was originally held by me, but it's possible that the young master was angry and threw the ink at Miss San. After listening to Madam and Miss San's words, Su Hailin looked at Wang Yuanyue's mother and daughter who were feeling guilty and asked, what did they say? Madam said she has set her sights on Gu Jinfan as her son. In law, making Miss San well prepared and dressed up beautifully. Miss San is also worried that Gu Jinfan may not be handsome. Su Yana paused, seemingly worried and asked, Father, do you think the young master should tell the people of the Gu family all these things he heard? The Gu family is a diplomatic family that has been influenced by Western customs since childhood, so they are commonly referred to as Mrs. Gu and Mr. Gu in the local area, with very few people referring to them as Mr. and Mrs. Lau. After listening to Su Hailin, she almost fainted. If this statement is truly spread, then this batch of goods will really be hanging. People from the Gu family may think that they are trying to borrow business to climb up to the Gu family. Today, no one knows that the Gu family wants a foreign daughter. In law. The mother and daughter of Wang Yuanyue, whose thoughts were pierced, looked guilty. You too. Su Hailin was so angry that he trembled all over. He grabbed Wang Yuanyue's hair hard and was about to slap her. Su Liman quickly said, my grandfather once taught Mr. Gu homework for several years and has a friendship with the Gu family. Since we need to seek help from our grandfather, we can't let Amu have a wound on his face. Yana looked coldly at the mother and daughter. In such matters, their minds are spinning fast. Wang Yuanyue immediately said, "That's right, I'm going to find my father right now. It's just the master. I heard that this young master has been abroad since he was born and only came back 6 months ago. He doesn't understand our local dialect and only knows foreign language. So since that's the case, how can Yana communicate with the young master?" Su Liman immediately agreed, "Yes, Su Yana, you intentionally attracted the young master and designed all of this, right?" Su Hailin looked at Su Yana with a sorrowful expression. "You're really enough. If you don't welcome me, just let me know. When I go back to my countryside, I'll be blamed for anything, even a servant can boss me around." Su Yana seemed angry and crossed her waist, "But even if I leave, I must make this matter clear. I can communicate with that child because I also understand foreign language, and just now the child ran over and said to Gu Jinfan, 'These two women are bullying me, big brother, you have to make up for me.'" Su Hailin's face turned white. Su Liman mocked her and said, "Su Yana, you're not lying here anymore. You're a woman from a remote rural area, how could you possibly speak foreign language?" Su Hailin was stabbed again and glared angrily at Su Liman. Su Liman realized it later and quickly closed his mouth. Su Yana looked at and waited for Su Hailin to glare at the mother and daughter before slowly speaking, "What's the difficulty? Now, most of the people on the street are foreigners, and there aren't many foreigners in Yao County, but there are also 1 or 2 who settle there. I know that Father A is a kind father who will definitely come to pick me up, so naturally I need to learn some foreign language. As an exchange, I teach foreigners Mandarin and foreigners teach me foreign languages. Is there anything wrong?" Wang Yuanyue was immediately choked. "Enough, don't argue anymore." Su Hailin had already determined that the mother and daughter had caused the trouble. "I have said many times that Yana came to the city and you must not trouble her. Now, for the sake of your dispute, it has caused me to lose such a big order." He was ferocious and terrifying. "Wang Yuanyue and Su Liman, you better pray that this order is still saved, otherwise I won't spare you." As soon as she finished speaking, Su Hailin dragged Wang Yuanyue's hair and cursed as she walked. Suleiman didn't care about anything else and quickly followed up. Looking at the appearance of a dragging oil bottle following behind the resentful couple, Su Yana couldn't help but sneer. "Look, the man that Wang Yuanyue tried her best to snatch is just like this. She must also let Wang Yuanyue taste the pain and suffering she has endured in this relationship. When she has tasted it enough and knows what she is trying to marry, then she will be waiting for the Yanwang Palace. Of course, it's best for couples to walk together. If Su Hailin doesn't go down and kneel to apologize to her mother, then what's the deal?" Su Yana turned around and went upstairs. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Runaway from Home. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Runaway from home. On that day, at midnight, Su Yana heard cries and whips coming from outside. Among them, Wang Yuanyue's crying even overshadowed Su Liman at one point. Su Yana stood in the corridor on the 2nd floor, gnawing on melon seeds and listening to this beautiful cry. Her suppressed heart seemed to have found a vent. She also grabbed a handful of melon seeds and distributed them to Jiue, saying, "The whip I asked you to prepare is the kind with a slight thorn, right?" "Yes, I have followed your instructions and placed it in the most prominent position in the front hall." Su Yana smiled contentedly and closed her eyes to listen. Yes, as she expected, the Duke of the Kingdom was not able to impress the Lord. Gu Xiang knew that it was the elderly son of Mrs. Gu who almost risked her life, and the whole family doted on him. Su Liman dared to take action against this young ancestor, which was undoubtedly groundbreaking on the head of the Tai Sui. However, the 3-year relationship between teachers and students has faded in the past few years. Compared to my son, it's nothing. On the other hand, Su Hailin, who had been shut off by his father-in-law, immediately got into a big fight with Wang Yuanyue and her daughter when he returned to the Su mansion. With this tone, he was holding back until he returned home before taking action. "I can't beat both of them in front of my father-in-law. Su Hailin slapped Wang Yuanyue in the face, his teeth itching with hatred, and said, "Do you really know how important this batch of goods is to me? If this batch of goods is successfully sold, I don't know how much money I can make. I only have 5 years of income like this. This is not a small sum of money, no wonder Su Hailin is so angry." Wang Yuanyue and Su Liman hugged each other and cried. Su Liman burst into tears and said, "Father, don't you think it strange? Our family has been living a good life, you have always loved me in AMU, but when Su Yana returned home, something big happened immediately. Either Su Yana was causing trouble or she was just a disaster." Su Hailin also had doubts in this regard, but in this matter, Su Yana has always been passive, and it is the mother and daughter who have been taking the initiative to cause trouble. "You said, if it weren't for you two being arrogant and domineering, how could this incident have happened today?" He cursed loudly and kicked Su Liman hard. Wang Yuanyue was beaten up to tears and nose, saying, "Master, we have a banquet at the Su family tomorrow. Even if you hit me, don't hit me in the face, otherwise it would be difficult to explain tomorrow, but I know I made a mistake. It's appropriate for the master to beat me to calm down. After all, she has been married for many years and knows how to handle Su Hailin very well." As expected, Su Hailin's expression was slightly relaxed, and he really wasn't as aggressive as before. He sat on the side dejectedly and said, "It's over, this is completely over. This batch of goods is so valuable, it's really over now." Wang Yuanyue's mother and daughter breathed a sigh of relief when they saw him stop fighting. At this moment, the butler suddenly rushed in and said, "Master, someone from Gu Mansion has arrived." Su Hailin paused and exclaimed in surprise, "Who's here?" "He is the butler of Gu Mansion." Upon hearing this, Su Hailin immediately went to meet him. Wang Yuanyue and her daughter also wanted to go, but thought that their face had swollen into a pig's head, they could only stop in the room. Su Hailin greeted the butler of Gu Mansion with a smile from a distance. The butler said, "Madam wants to see Miss Su." Subconsciously, Su Hailin thought he wanted to see Su Liman and began to regret not slapping her face. "Okay, I'll have Le Man prepare now." The butler said, "It's not Miss Le Man, it's Miss Su Yana." Su Hailin was stunned. However, when he heard that Mrs. Gu wanted to see Su Yana, he rushed to find her immediately. From afar, passing by the rockery, I saw Su Yana carrying her tattered wicker box as she was about to leave. He quickly walked over and said, "Yana, where are you going this big night?" Su Yana's innocent face was full of grievances. "Of course, I want to go back to the countryside. Anyway, no one here welcomes me, and staying here is just an eyesore." Su Hailin was sweating profusely, but now that the people from Gu Mansion had arrived, he could only coax this ancestor. "What are you saying, Yana? Where is your father? Your home is there. How could anyone not welcome you?" Su Yana couldn't bear it anymore and shouted angrily, "All right, don't pretend anymore." Su Hailin was taken aback. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Go to Gu's home. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Go to Gu's home. What Su Hailin was thinking at the time was, could it be that Su Yana knew that Guan Shi was killed by him who condoned Wang Yuanyue? Su Yana's tears welled up and she felt very aggrieved. "Father, to be honest, haven't you ever loved me? Otherwise, why wouldn't you listen to my explanation? Although today's incident has nothing to do with me, you have been suspecting me." She shed tears, pitifully, sobbing uncontrollably. Su Hailin looked at it and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. So it's because of this. But it's normal to think about it. After all, Yana is only 14 or 15 years old, and he doesn't care about it for so many years. It's normal to feel wronged. But this further proves that she yearns for fatherly love in her heart and has no resentment towards him. In Su Yana's unjust accusations, Su Hailin can almost be certain that she is just an ordinary rural child with no ulterior motives. "Elegant, this is indeed my father's fault. I apologize to you. tomorrow's banquet, my father will definitely help you clean up the dust, and I will treat you well in the future. Really? Yana's eyes were watery, with long eyelashes and tears hanging from them. She was charming and particularly lovable. Although Su Hailin is very scumbag, which man wouldn't like a soft and cute daughter? His heart was about to melt. Even though half a cup of tea was still in a rage, he now had a fatherly expression on his face and said, "Of course it's true, however, Yana, my father is in some trouble now. The Gu family said they want to see you. You should know that the Gu family cannot afford to offend us, so you still need to go there." Upon hearing this, Yana was aggrieved but obedient and said, "Okay, whatever my father says, my daughter will do." So, is my daughter going to see the Gu family now? Although she had a bad temper, she was still very obedient, which made Su Hailin particularly satisfied. "Go, but that's a new style mansion over there, so don't take Jiue with you. Gu Fu has always been influenced by Western countries, and many things are quite westernized. They feel that taking care of maids when going out is a very outdated behavior, and even feel it is very inhumane. Okay, then listen to your father." She smiled with her eyes curved, so she was very obedient. Su Hailin thought it was easy to coax this daughter and then sent her to the carriage of the Gu family. When Su Hailin arrived, she didn't forget to ask Su Yana to mention her batch of goods, and Su Yana also pledged to do so. Su Hailin was satisfied with Su Yana's obedience and watched her get into the carriage of Gu mansion. Su Yana seemed to rely heavily on her father and even opened the carriage window to wave to Su Hailin. Su Hailin looked at her innocent daughter and breathed a sigh of relief, quite liking her. On the other side, Su Yana, sitting alone in the carriage, wiped away the tears from her face expressionlessly. It seems that Su Hailin is not very clever either. She sneered. Yes, how could Su Yana, who has reborn her lifelong memory, not know that the little boy is the youngest son of the Gu family? In his past life, Su Hailin relied on picking up the lost Gu Xiangji to obtain a large order from the Gu family and save a large amount of money, thus becoming a rising star in the eyes of foreigners. At present, it is during the invasion of Nanhua, and in half a year, Nanyang culture will become a new trend and be sought after by young people. A businessman who can catch such a fast train can bend down and pick up money. Su Yana needs to first solve Wang Yuanyue and her daughter, clear the obstacles in the Su mansion, and then. It's Gu Xiaojun. Su Fu, she will swallow it someday. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Inviting the Emperor to the Urn. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Inviting the Emperor to the Urn. Gu Mansion is not far from Su Mansion, but it's time for a cup of tea. The Gu Mansion is very large and imposing, with a facade similar to that of the Su Mansion, but there is a unique cave inside. The architecture of Gu Mansion is still old-fashioned, but the decoration and some decorations inside are all Western things, even the vase placed on the ground is very Western style. They also built a sunny room in the yard, which is very beautiful and filled with flowers. Su Yana is not surprised by the waves. Although the Gu family is very imposing, Su Yana has seen even more magnificent Western architecture in her past life, and she has even traveled across the sea to many countries. After twists and turns, she was taken by the butler to Mrs. Gu. Mrs. Gu sat on the white fabric sofa, knitting yarn while watching Gu Xiangji do his homework. "Madam, Miss Su is here." The butler said that Mrs. Gu only then looked at Su Yana. Mrs. Gu has lived in Nanyang for several years and often accompanies her husband to some Western countries without a fixed residence. She has many friends overseas, but when she returned to her own country, she didn't have many friends. "Are you Miss Yana?" Mrs. Gu smiled lightly and was very friendly to her. "Butler, go make Miss Su a cup of matcha milk. It's sweet, and I think Miss Su will like it." "I've met Mrs. Gu." Su Yana bowed and said, "Mrs. Gu doesn't need to be so polite. I'm a junior. If Mrs. Gu doesn't mind, you can just call me Yana." Mrs. Gu smiled and nodded. Although Gu Xiangji on the side seemed to be doing homework, his thoughts were focused on the conversation between his mother and Su Yana. According to Xiangji, you also know foreign language. After chatting a few casual words, Mrs. Gu finally got to the point. Su Yana smiled, not feeling cramped or uneasy, and with a sense of family demeanor, she said, a little bit. In the countryside before, there was a foreigner who came to live for a long time. In exchange, I taught her Chinese and she taught me foreign. Mrs. Gu suddenly realized, but she still kept an eye on it and said, but you've been in the countryside all along. How could you suddenly want to learn foreign language? It's not easy to learn a language well. Being idle is also being idle. Learning is endless, isn't life always on the path of learning? Su Yana was very calm. Mrs. Gu's eyes showed a hint of appreciation as she said, what a never-ending student. Some young girls nowadays always want to marry into prestigious families as soon as possible, which is really boring. Like many girls in the West, they are all very talented, they can hold up the sky on their own, without relying on men, thinking about those courtyard fights all day long. I also think so. With the increasing openness of the times, girls' thinking will also be further enlightened. Perhaps in the coming years, it will not be as it is now. Su Yana said, in fact, she herself is also looking forward to that day. Mrs. Gu smiled and said, do you mind if I talk to you in foreign language? I'm used to speaking in foreign language, but the local language is really awkward. Sure. Su Yana said, responding in a foreign language. The two began to communicate in foreign languages. Mrs. Gu was pleasantly surprised to find that Su Yana's foreign language was no different from the local language. After returning to Yangchuan, apart from communicating with some foreigners, she hardly ever had such a pleasant conversation with locals in foreign language. What does this idiom mean, AMU? Gu Xiangji, who was doing homework, suddenly looked up and asked Mrs. Gu this question. Mrs. Gu lowered her head and immediately made a mistake. She knows this word in Chinese, but when it comes to foreign languages, she doesn't know how to interpret or pronounce it. Su Yana glanced and found that Gu Xiangji was asking about Qian Lv's poor skills. The meaning of this word is. Su Yana explained fluently to Gu Xiangji in foreign language, leaving Mrs. Gu stunned. She had never seen anyone explain Chinese idioms so clearly in foreign language. Because there is a significant difference between Chinese and foreign languages, when translated from Chinese to foreign languages, the meaning is no longer the same. Sentences with multiple interpretations become very thin. So translating Chinese into foreign languages is not only a literal translation, but also requires translating the meanings behind it. Miss Su, you're really amazing. You can even translate this, Mrs. Gu said with a sigh. You don't know, I've hired several gentlemen, they only teach Chinese, although they know a little foreign language, they can't translate this meaning at all. And because I traveled to multiple countries with my husband in my early years, I am familiar with foreign language, but many Chinese are unfamiliar, so I don't know how to teach my child Mrs. Gu is very regretful. Although we have been wandering around, we are all from Yangchuan. As descendants of Yangchuan, we do not know the language of our homeland, which is a sad thing. My eldest son is fine. He was in Yangchuan before the age of 15, and as my youngest son, he hardly understands Chinese. Speaking of this matter, Mrs. Gu has a headache. Chinese is not easy to learn, it's normal to learn slowly. When I learned to write when I was a child, I used to say that my characters were like symbols. Especially when learning to write with a pen, because I have always been used to writing with a brush, I don't even know how to hold it. Mrs. Gu looked at her with a smile, thinking she was humble, but upon hearing this, Gu Xiangji couldn't help but glance at Su Yana twice. Su Yana gave a faint smile to the mother and daughter, and they talked happily together. Mrs. Gu liked her very much, and later even kept her for supper. Later, Mrs. Gu was surprised to find that her younger son, who had always been introverted and disliked strangers, had voluntarily stayed at the table and had dinner with Yana. This has never happened before. A plan was deeply ingrained in Mrs. Gu's heart. Gu Xiangji was very interested in Yana, and his dark eyes kept staring at her from time to time. Yana knew, but she didn't see it either, but she occasionally looked up and met Gu Xiangji with an indifferent smile. At this moment, Gu Xiangji would turn his gaze back, feeling shy and a bit embarrassed, but soon he would sneak a peek at Yana again. The butler suddenly came in from outside and reported, "Madam, the young master has returned." "Then add him a bowl and chopsticks." Mrs. Gu lowered her head and continued to feed her youngest son, but in fact, Yu Guang had been paying attention to Yana. Yana's gaze remained fixed, knowing that Mrs. Gu was looking at her. She is probing. "Give me a glass of ice water." Gu Jinfan came out from outside, holding a leather briefcase in his hand. Nowadays, these Western things are not in circulation in the local area and cannot be bought. The man, who had been busy all afternoon, was about to tease his younger brother when he looked up and found Yana. His eyebrows and eyes sank, and a hint of disgust flashed through his seemingly gentle face. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. The Stumbling Blocks of the First Move in Chess. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. The Stumbling Blocks of the First Move in Chess. Yana stood up and nodded slightly at him. "I've seen Mr. Gu." Gu Jinfan felt that such a term was outdated, and he didn't like the old-fashioned jacket and skirt that Yana was wearing. Although it looked pleasing to the eye and didn't have the rustic atmosphere he thought, he just didn't like it. However, he still smiled at Yana and said politely, "You don't need to be polite. The visitor is a guest, and our family doesn't need this kind of etiquette either." Yana smiled indifferently, but she knew that this man didn't like her. Perhaps he will be her biggest obstacle in her first move. After finishing the night snack, Yana also had to go back because Mrs. Gu liked her very much and wanted to give her a gift. She went to the collection pavilion on the second floor to search, and in no time, Gu Jinfan also walked up, leaving only Yana and Gu Xiangji on the first floor. Gu Xiangji was writing his homework, but the child who was originally writing with great enthusiasm stopped writing and frowned. Yana walked over and solved the problem for this little guy. Gu Xiangji is very intelligent and easy to teach, but what's difficult is that he doesn't understand Chinese and can only speak to him in foreign language. Learning a language is not easy, and it is also difficult to speak fluently and use it fluently. But whether it's Chinese or foreign, Yana always speaks at the same time, and both languages are at the same level as her mother tongue. Of course, this is mainly attributed to her previous life of memorizing letters one by one. Yana tutored Gu Xiangji on his homework, and soon his homework was completed. Thank you. Gu Xiangji pulled Yana's sleeve and said, but he said both of these words awkwardly. Yana also replied to him, "No need to thank you." Gu Xiangji smiled and suddenly pulled her to the second floor. But Yana felt it was impolite to walk around the other person's house, so she refused. Later, Gu Xiangji pulled several more times, but when he saw that Yana was still motionless, he became angry. He ran upstairs angrily. Yana hesitated for a moment, but finally went up. The first move of her rebirth, this little one is very important and cannot be offended. Yana followed up, and the little one also noticed her. She didn't look so angry anymore, but the little one's footsteps were too fast, and Yana just lost track of her. She stood in the corridor on the second floor, with no trace of the little one on either side. "No, I absolutely disagree." Just as Yana didn't know what to do, the man's cold voice suddenly came to her ears. "It's Gu Jinfan." She thought for a moment and walked over. "Why not? It's difficult to find a teacher who can speak foreign language now. There's a ready-made one now. Do you hope your younger brother doesn't understand the language of his hometown in the future?" It's Mrs. Gu's voice. I think this woman is not simple. Since the first meeting, I have not liked her. Underneath her seemingly weak appearance, she is actually ambitious. She has a deep inner world, and we cannot lure wolves into her house. Jin Fan, what you said is a bit unpleasant. Miss Su is not as unpleasant as you think. You didn't like her at first glance, but I did like her very much at first glance. The most important thing is that Xiangji also likes her very much, which is very important. Xiangji has a tendency towards autism, and you don't know that. Don't you want Xiangji to learn his hometown dialect well? Regarding this, I will look for good teachers for Xiangji in the future, but Su Yana will definitely not do it. Why are you so stubborn? The mother and son started arguing inside the house. Su Yana was listening outside, with a hint of gloom in her eyes. It seems that she guessed correctly. Gu Jinfan is indeed her stumbling block. While she was pondering, the door suddenly opened from inside. The man frowned, his expression displeased, and he couldn't see the elegance he had just shown. It was more of a violent aura. Su Yana coincidentally met him head-on. The man's eyebrows and eyes sank. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Sword and Crossbow Tension. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Sword and Crossbow Tension. Unpreparedly, Su Yana got into a fight with the man in front of her. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, it was Xiangji who wanted to bring me up, but he ran too fast and I couldn't keep up with him. Su Yana was stunned for a moment, then calmly explained. But Gu Jinfan clearly didn't believe it. He stared at the woman in front of him, and a sarcastic curve suddenly curved his lips. In this environment with only two people, he directly tore open his elegant and refined coat. Xiangji hasn't taken a shower yet. Remember to ask the wet nurse to take Xiangji to take a shower later. Where did I put that hairpin? Mrs. Gu's voice came from the treasure pavilion, as she was still searching for something to give to Su Yana. Gu Jinfan did not respond, while Su Yana also smelled a sinister and dangerous aura. She instinctively stepped back, but Gu Jinfan was very strong and pulled her directly towards the room on the third floor. He pinched her in pain. Su Yana frowned and instinctively wanted to struggle, but she didn't dare to make too much noise. Gu Jinfan had no expression on his face, but a fierce aura swirled around him. He pushed open the door of a room and entered, which was the study. Su Yana was thrown at the desk and her waist was hit hard. She frowned in pain, but didn't let out a muffled groan. The door was slammed shut, and the atmosphere was stiff. Gu Jinfan looked at Su Yana as if she was looking at an aggressor. Su Yana knew she couldn't escape, so she decided not to run. She is still calm, not even aggrieved. She wrapped her hands around her chest and stood tall, as if she were the hostess of this area. What do you want to do? Gu Jinfan was taken aback for a moment, looking at the woman in front of her who was not at all timid. No, it should be a young girl who was not afraid at all. He has inherited his father's business and worked as a diplomat for so many years. He has seen too many women who want to use Xiangji's position to become Mrs. Gu and Mrs. Gu, so he has seen too many women like Su Yana. He roughly tugged at his tie and sneered, I should be asking you this question. What do you want to do? I want to go out, will you open the door and let me out? Su Yana spoke slowly, but in this tense atmosphere, her request was so unrealistic, yet sincere. The man suddenly chuckled and looked at the girl in front of him, somewhat sarcastic, but more incomprehensible. No matter what medicine you sell in your gourd, there are some things that I have said many times, but I don't mind repeating them, but they are the only time for you. His eyes darkened as he gradually approached Su Yana, his hand quickly gripping her chin. Listen, don't think of the Gu family and Xiangji, otherwise you will die very miserably. If you think your father is one of the three nobles and can do whatever he wants, then you are too naive. Su Yana's gaze was forced to meet him, and at this moment, she was no different from being held by someone with a knife around her neck. But the girl remained silent, even when the man added gravity. Gu Jinfan noticed that her eyes were surprisingly beautiful, clearly black and white, very clear. Master Gu, she suddenly spoke with a smile, do you think you are very handsome and charming? I probably haven't even given you a smile. What kind of confidence makes you feel that I am happy with you? At the end of the conversation, she snorted a few more times and was extremely sarcastic. I really dislike it or pretend, Gu Jinfan can tell at a glance. He pursed his thin lips tightly. And at that moment, the girl in front of him suddenly kissed her lips. End of this chapter.